Did it just kick you off? Okay. So, hello everybody. This is Rachel, and thank you for signing on today to our webinar about how gender norms hurt Jewish girls. I am so thrilled to have Riki Wilchins with us, even with the hurricane coming down. Riki is representing organization True Child, who has presented to the Jewish Women's Funding Network on a couple occasions and does incredible work around the area of gender norms. So Riki is the author of 3 books on gender theory, and the writing and research all focuses on gender and has been published all over the place, from the New York Times to Time Magazine to every other major publication you can think of. Riki has conducted trainings at the White House, at the CDC, for many different women donor networks, and including Women Moving Millions. And as I mentioned at our trustee meeting, there has been funding for True Child from a couple of different Jewish women's foundations to develop a white paper and some presentations to be able to take around the country, and I guess potentially around the world, around this issue, and Riki will tell us more about that. So just some housekeeping. I don't hear anything, so I think y'all are muted. If you haven't muted your line, please go ahead and do that. We're going to hold questions until the end. If you do have a question, you can wait and then say it at the end. If you have a microphone on your computer or if you've called into the line, you can enter it in the chat function on the webinar. If you can't figure out either of those things, you can send me an email and we will take questions at the end. So with no further ado, Riki Wilchins. Riki, are you there?
I'm sorry, I had to.
Oh, okay.
I had to mute myself because my daughter's in the background, and I forgot to demute myself.
Oh, okay. Now we've got you.
Looks like the video feed is also coming through. So we are going to talk a little bit today about also not only Jewish girls and gender norms, but also why this is a population that's sometimes been overlooked. I think there are kind of 2 cases to make around addressing gender norms, and hopefully I'm going to make a little bit of both of them today. One is the efficacy argument that when you address gender norms, you get better outcomes because it's such a huge thing in the life of adolescent girls. But the other thing I think is also just the social justice argument that because gender equity is so important, and it's an important part of social justice to address gender equity, that we need to put gender norms into that mix. So hopefully I'll talk a little bit about both of them today. So let's go to the next slide, which is all about me. I think Rachel just covered most of this. I've been doing this for quite a while. So I'll pause for a second. Hopefully you're all awed into submission, and we'll go on to the next slide. My favorite thing about this, I always make this joke on the Time magazine cover in the lower right. You can't see that little red bar, but if they didn't want to waste any more time on me, they did filler that actually says others who made a difference, and where it actually has the picture of Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King. It's like we all kind of hang out together, you know. So, oh, and I also write books. That is not me on the cover. That's my last one. Several of these are being used in college. It's kind of cool. So this exercise I call it 6 degrees of gender. I'm not going to do the whole thing today, but we're going to try to disambiguate gender a little bit, because when you start talking about gender, people assume, first of all, that you're talking just about women and girls or just about transgender. And what we're trying to talk today is more about gender equity, which is ensuring that there's equal access to resources and opportunity for boys and girls, men and women. And then, of course, gender norms, which these socially constructed scripts and expectations that pretty much all of us start internalizing from the time we're born for how to be a boy or a girl, how to do male or female. And if you think kind of more generally about, norms sounds like a scary word, but one of our particular norms is that you don't burp in public. in some cultures it's considered wonderful behavior after a big meal to burp to show that you really, enjoyed your food. We consider that a faux pas. Another norm, actually I was reading an article by someone who said, pushing back against social norms suggested next time you're in an elevator, a very full elevator, just start reading off the floor numbers one at a time as you go through them. It's like we don't do that. There's nothing wrong with it. It doesn't hurt anybody. It's just a norm that we don't do. So the gender norms piece of that are the things that we teach ourselves and teach our kids about that are specifically related to expectations for being male or female. Nothing really, it sounds like a complicated word, it isn't. An even more complicated word invented by my friend Geeta Rao Gupta in the lower right-hand corner, who's been a leader on this, is gender transformative. I'm not going to talk about that phrase too much today. It's kind of a mouthful, but it has become the term of art among international organizations doing this work. But it refers to programs or funding priorities that try to hold up and highlight and even change rigid gender norms and the inequities they cause. And I want to repeat that last part. They try to change rigid gender norms and the inequities they cause, because if I'm trying to loop that back and connect it again with gender equity and say, well, we see inequities where, girls don't have the same rights and privileges as boys. And we say, well, let's give them money in programs. And what we're trying to tell people is that's important, but to get to gender equity, we need to talk about the attitudes and beliefs and practices that happened upstream that led to those unequal outcomes and behaviors. So beliefs and attitudes drive behavior and outcomes, not the other way around. It's easy as a funder to see, you don't see girls going into science and math, say, oh, we want to start more science and math programs for girls. We want to start more role models. We start interrogating the attitudes the girls themselves hold as well, because that also leads to behavior. So let's talk a little bit next about gender norms more generally. I got to remind myself that you guys are about 2 seconds behind me, so excuse me if I'm talking about something you don't see. I'll try to bear that in mind. Gender norms are learned, especially during what many experts call the gender intensification period of adolescence and early teens, when interest in traditional gender norms starts to accelerate and belief in them starts to solidify. Yes, that is the rapper Little Bow Wow kissing his guns there. Gender norms affect all youth. I think that as a society we're starting to understand now that kids who are in any way gender nonconforming or actually gay or transgender often grow up with lower life outcomes. If you think about gender norms more broadly, the point we're trying to make today is that even boys and girls who do conform to rigid ideals for masculinity and femininity also face lower life outcomes. So I think we kind of gotten the first one. This presentation is about the second one, about the kids who do conform and what that does. Let's talk a little bit specifically about masculinity and femininity. The field was invented actually by a researcher named Dr. Joe Pleck. You can see him on the bottom there, at the University of Illinois in Chicago, who decided to start seeing if he could develop a scale to measure how strongly young men bought into traditional notions of masculinity as defined by attributes like strength, aggression, sexual prowess, emotional toughness, and so forth. And so he actually was able to develop one of the first scales to do that, and then he thought, well, this is really interesting. I'd like to see if you could tie this to behavior. Remember, I keep saying over and over that, attitudes and beliefs are what drive behavior and outcomes. And lo and behold, he found that there was a very, very strong link. The more strongly young men internalized these traditionally masculine ideals, the more likely they were to have more and earlier sexual experiences. They were likely to engage more in risk-taking behavior, not only with sex, but also things like drugs and cars and so forth. More likely to drop out of school early, more likely to get pushed out of school by what are called zero-tolerance policies, more likely to engage in partner abuse or even bullying at school. So kind of a checklist of lower life outcomes, and this is not the entire list, it's a good sample. By the way, in the lower right with the six-pack abs, that was Rachel and I 10 years ago, for those of you who are wondering where that picture came from. So that was us in better days. Let's see. Femininity. You gotta love, there's the Disney princesses. It's all the same girl. They just keep changing the hair. I love it. Traditional femininity is defined by being deferential, desirable, and dependent, what I call the 3 T's of traditional femininity. Again, when you look at the correlations, they're very strong. Girls who buy into those and have a very strong belief in them, more likely to have early or unplanned pregnancies, more likely to defer to their partner's sexual prerogatives, more likely to drop out of school early or have school problems, more likely to tolerate abusive relationships, unfortunately, and more likely to grow up economically and psychologically dependent on an older, stronger male partner, especially because that's one of the ways girls show that they are, very attractive to men, is to find that older, stronger, high-status alpha male. So let's talk a little bit about the specific resonances for Jewish girls. There are a number of things we could have picked on. I used some that we picked out in the white paper, I think, that Rachel circulated for y'all. One of them, obviously, is around issues of food and body weight. This can be especially problematic for Jewish girls who don't fit, popular Nordic ideals of being tall, willowy, athletic, and small-featured with, blue eyes and straight blonde hair. We've all seen those images on the runways. And while there are certainly Jewish girls who do fit that, there are also significant numbers who don't, who have, shorter, zoftig bodies, dark eyes, kinky hair, and those kinds of body image ideals can be very difficult for such girls. Also, the cultural emphasis on food, and particularly women's role in preparing and serving food and so forth, can make it very difficult around issues of food and weight. And then the mixed messages, eat, you look like a bird, don't get fat. And it's funny because someone who actually does a lot of work in this space was reading that part of our paper and said, I really object to this. It's a cultural stereotype, but yes, I heard these in my own family. So, some of these are a little, I think, some of these observations may ring true. Some of them may also seem generalizations, but hopefully you're getting kind of an idea of why this is an issue. One prominent researcher has said that the pressures around both excelling and excellence and food are so significant that eating disorders have become the disorder of choice among Jewish girls, which I thought was an interesting way to put it, the disorder of choice among Jewish girls. That kind of leads us into leadership and achievement. I love that picture on the lower right. Girls get this pressure from an early age in many communities to go to the right prep school, right college, get the right advanced degree that they're expected to achieve. But they're also at the same time supposed to maintain a size 3 or 4 figure, look flawless in high heels, and be popular socially and find and identify and marry a high status male who can support them psychologically and financially for the rest of their lives. And when I was doing our presentation to the funding board of the Jewish Women's Foundation of New York, one of the women followed us out in the hall and handed me a small slip of paper. On it was written, older, smarter, taller, smarter, taller, stronger. And I said, what is this? And she said, this is what I was told to look for in a husband. And I just thought, wow, that's really intense. And if you flip that over, someone else said to me, said, what does that mean? The girl was taught to find someone, or the boy was taught to find someone younger, weaker, dumber, etc. So you'd like to think that a lot of that has changed. I'm not sure it has changed entirely. There are also a significant kind of undercurrent, although it's never explicitly stated, that men have careers, women have families, support their career husbands, and run nonprofits and community groups. And this is like almost everything that I'm saying here is not at all unique to the Jewish community. We find this in lots of other communities as well, that male work is valued and more highly valued and often more highly paid, and women's work and profession comes second. A man who has a successful career, is well published, makes a lot of money, is seen as successful, but a woman who does the same is somehow considered to have sacrificed family life if she doesn't also have kids and become a mother. So there's this kind of dual kind of pressure around women and a devaluing of work in the home and an overvaluing of male work. And also mixed messages about femininity and power. Often Jewish girls, and not only Jewish girls, this also happens with Italian girls and others from different cultures, but are seen as, too loud, too aggressive, too domineering and so forth. So a lot of mixed messages for girls around leadership and achievement. And then finally, just a lot of mixed messages around the place of women and girls in the community. The sense that, and we found this in a lot of, we did something like 24 interviews with mothers and daughters, the sense that girls are supposed to be educated, empowered, and accomplished, but are somehow never the main act, that the religion and the culture in many ways still has a very patriarchal bias, even in very progressive communities that are very dedicated to women and girls, that somehow, boys are always kind of the main act. And I don't know if I put it in there. Oh, I didn't put it in here. So I want to mention this story that, you collect these wonderful stories when you're doing interviews about a woman who had, I think this made this into the white paper, who had 4 girls. And she said she had lost count of the number of times that complete strangers would walk up to her after synagogue and say, are you going to try one more time to see if you can have a boy? And her takeaway from that was, if you flip it on its head, if she had 4 sons, how many strangers would be stopping her after shul to say, are you going to try one more time to see if you can have a girl? But even in just these little interactions, which are intended to be entirely friendly and supportive, there's still the sense that, boys are the big deal. Boys are a big deal. Well, here we go. That was in the second one. I didn't realize I put it in there. Cool. Girls there's certainly extra pressure on girls to keep themselves attractive, wear certain clothes, have a certain body weight to attract males. In some parts of the community, as you all know, body weight is actually tracked by matchmakers to make sure that girls are appropriately attractive for boys. We don't do that for males at all. And the comments that we often hear at family get-togethers about weight or size are almost always directed at girls' bodies and body shapes, and almost never, very seldom in my experience anyway, and most of those we interviewed at boys. So girls' bodies and body weight and attractiveness are almost considered like a communal property to be managed by all in the family. And then finally, I just love this quote. This came from a woman on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. She said, we're starting to finally connect all these things, the obsession with boys, the deferential behavior to men, the very few Jewish women running things. It's all part of one big story of how we keep undermining our girls and our dreams for our girls. And what I found kind of really, really striking about that quote is she comes from a very, very progressive synagogue that is deeply and authentically committed to raising up equity for girls, and yet there are still these very long-standing ideas that seem to run like an almost unconscious bias through a lot of the interactions with women and girls. So a few questions that I sometimes get at this point in the presentation. Can't we just keep focusing on gender equity and kind of ignore the gender norms piece? And the answer to that, of course, is yes. I mean, that's what most organizations that think they have a gender lens are doing. They are really focusing strongly on the gender equity piece. I think the larger answer is that it's really hard to get to gender equity without going through gender norms. And one of the things I cite on this is the World Bank, which has invested hundreds of millions of dollars in grants and loans and other forms of direct aid to improve the lot of women and girls. And they found that you hit kind of a ceiling on how much you can achieve doing that. And so they did this huge, huge research study that talked to 5,000 people in like 200 communities in more than 24 countries. And they found that the glass ceiling was in fact gender norms, that if communal attitudes were that women and girls don't do X, it was extremely difficult to move significant numbers of women and girls into doing X, no matter how much you invested. There was simply a point of diminishing returns. And so they've started a very highly public 5-year campaign to move gender norms to the center of their work. In fact, they've said the president, the CEO of the World Bank just put a statement saying that gender norms is as powerful an influence of inequities as opportunity, jobs, and funding. So I think it's a really good statement about this. Yes, you need jobs and funding and opportunity and programming for girls, but you also have to address the attitudes and belief systems that make those inequities possible and sustain them. So, some people look at this and go, well, these are mostly developing countries, but I don't think it's all that different here. Well, we just kind of focused on that. I duplicated a slide. So am I saying it's all gender norms? I hope I'm not saying that. These are, everything we're talking about today are, complex, multifaceted problems. I'm not trying to oversell this as a silver bullet. I am trying to say that whatever programming you're doing for women and young women and girls, if you're looking for the next big drop on the meter in programmatic effectiveness, it would have to be gender norms, because when you're talking about adolescent girls, learning how to be a feminine young woman and be recognized as one by your community is a primary rite of passage, perhaps the primary rite of passage for almost every young girl. And yet it's the one things that programs that believe that they have a strong gender lens tend to ignore. So I guess the bottom line for that is that, our conviction, I think the research for the last 30 years bears this out, is that when you teach young people to think critically about harmful gender norms, you get better life outcomes than if you ignore them. I kind of want to repeat that because it's kind of the it's kind of the point of this whole webinar. When you teach young people to think critically about harmful gender norms, you get better life outcomes than if you ignore them. So just want to point out there is a very, very strong research base on this. I don't know if folks use Google Scholar at all, but I did some quick searches a few weeks ago. If you look up economic empowerment and femininity, you get almost 1,266 articles. Google Scholar is a rough-edged tool at best, so probably half of them are not on point. But you still end up with 400 studies. So there's a lot of work on this. Body dissatisfaction and femininity, you get over 4,000 articles. Again, throw half of them out, you still have 2,000 articles on this. Leadership and femininity, 51,800 articles. So this has been extensively studied and documented by researchers. There's nothing I'm saying here that hasn't been proven by research. It's quite old. What is unique, I think, is that Jewish girls are almost never represented in these studies. They are in many of these studies, but they are not pulled out. And we couldn't find any really good studies that focus specifically on Jewish girls. So there's this sense that they only want to look at girls who are at risk, particularly in low-income communities, particularly girls of color, girls who are LGBT, but not at Jewish girls because they were considered relatively empowered. And you find some very impassioned dissertations from young Jewish girls themselves who have grown up in the community and are basically trying to convince people we need to be studying Jewish girls. They are, in fact, vulnerable to many of the same issues that other girls have. It just has a specific kind of cultural resonance to it. And I think their points are right. So there is not only a strong research base, there's also a very, very strong programmatic base. USAID, which does aid in developing country, UNAIDS, CARE, PEPFAR, the President's AIDS Initiative in Africa, International Center for Research on Women, UNFPA, the Population People, International Planned Parenthood, World Health Organization. We mentioned the World Bank. There's now so much information circulating about this kind of work around challenging gender norms at the international level. They even started a new organization, the Interagency Gender Working Group, or IGWG.org, which is incredibly difficult for me to say, just to collate information and share programs at the international level. So this is one of those few places where the international folks actually are ahead of us in the U.S. And they've been doing this for years. It is now considered, it's not even actually a discussion. It's just understood that if you're trying to improve equity for women and girls, you must address underlying beliefs and attitudes about the place of women and girls. You don't get very far. But in the U.S., again, there's always been this kind of disconnect. And one of the, I think the Bible of teen pregnancy and teen sexual behavior that most folks are familiar with in policy and funding communities is Emerging Answers. It's put out by the National Campaign to Prevent Teen Pregnancy. They get a ton of money from places like the Hewlett Foundation and Ford to produce this every few years. And I asked, I was actually going through it. Of course, the first thing I do when I get PDFs is I do a search on the words masculinity or femininity and gender norms. And of course, what you find out is that it's nowhere in there. So I did a search on this, and the only place the word masculinity appears is in footnote 295 in the title of Joe Pleck's original article on developing a masculinity scale. That was back in 1995. So he took 5 years to get that article to print, so you got to figure he actually did that work in like 89, let's say. So that's the only place. And I actually asked Dr. Douglas Kirby, who wrote Emerging Answers for the National Campaign Against Teen Pregnancy, I said, how can you write 200 pages on teen sexual behavior and nowhere mention the words masculinity or femininity? I mean, have you seen Risky Business? And he said, we are paid to evaluate programs, and we could not find any programs to evaluate in the U.S. So that tells you that we have, 30 years of good research, and it's had no impact whatsoever on policy or actual programming. I would have thought you would have also seen Greece, which is also all about gender roles and sexuality. It's just amazing. All these arguments circulate, and these studies circulate endlessly in the academic silo, but never emerge to really impact the greater world. I just one other example. I'm sorry, I'm marinating in this, but I just find this astounding. So when we relaunched this True Child 7 years ago, one of the first invitations I got to speak was at the White House, and the Office of National AIDS Policy was there, and I immediately, of course, went up and looked up the National AIDS Policy, which runs for 60 pages. And again, when you do a search on the word masculinity, or for that matter femininity, you can see it says no matches were found in that search message bar. So I just find this fascinating. So there are literally thousands of studies on the impact of masculinity on condom use, on not using condoms, on the need for, especially among gay men, for penetrative sex is the gold standard of masculinity, on the ties between masculinity and promiscuity among young men, et cetera, et cetera. And yet here's a 60-page national AIDS policy, dozens of years into the AIDS epidemic, does not mention it at all. So this is what a research policy disconnect looks like in practice. This is what a research policy disconnect looks like in practice. Thousands of studies and no impact on what we're doing at all. So I want to come back to Jewish girls as a vulnerable population. I think I said they are ignored in the literature. There are very few published studies, and there's also almost no data on them that you can get from academic studies. So this is another need, is not only to address the impact of feminine norms on Jewish girls, but also we just need more data. And this invitation, this plea was actually made in a dissertation published by a young woman, Greenberg, in 2009. You can see in the lower right. And she said, we're just not going to know enough until we collect more data. So everything that we're doing with the Jewish community, we're hoping will not only lead to deeper engagement with gender norms, but also to just collecting more data. We just don't know enough. It's not enough just to do these anecdotal interviews and small focus groups that I've done. We need to have more hard data. I do want to say that just when we're almost done here, thank you all for listening so patiently. There has been more of a growing disconnect around gender norms. The situation is not completely dark. We are seeing a growing list of leading nonprofits that are doing work that seriously engages gender norms, and also a number of foundations have now moved forward important grants that address gender norms as well. And a few of them have really started to think about this seriously in terms of where it impacts their funding priorities from the top down. Particularly the Women's Foundation of Minnesota, you'll see them in the middle there on the right. The George Family Foundation, the Women's Fund of Central Ohio, have all three actually made structural changes to put gender norms in their mission and their vision, their theory of change, which I think is a wonderful start. And always interesting, this comes first from the Women's Foundation because they have the feminist analysis. But I think the field is really catching up, and I also think this is finally starting to catch in the U.S. So we're just a little bit ahead of the curve here. So I think that's probably a good place to stop. Rachel, you want to unmute everybody, and we can do a little Q&A and see if I left any loose ends that people would like to address as well. And thank you all again for having me and for coming today.
Yes, thank you so much. So I also, when you mentioned earlier on, you said eating disorders have become the disorder of choice for Jewish girls. I mean, that was both upsetting and exciting for me because I actually just finalized yesterday a date in February where we are going to hold a community-wide educational event with the Eating Disorders Information Network to address this issue of eating disorders in the Jewish community and specifically with Jewish girls and Jewish women. So you teed that up perfectly, which was very exciting for me. So I did not actually mute the line, so if people are muted, you have done it yourselves. So I do have one question that already came in from Janet, and so I'm going to give that question over to Riki, and then everybody else can think of questions, and you can either say them or you can enter them in the chat bar. So Janet's question is, are Orthodox girl, is there a different risk for Orthodox girls versus more egalitarian Jewish sex?
Yes. And yes, and we did not look deeply into that, so it's not going to be reflected in the paper or in the model curriculum. But yes, of course, the strictures tend to be, again, I'm so wary of making blanket statements, but of course they tend to be much narrower, and often the penalties for transgressing traditional norms can be harsher and are more stringent in Orthodox communities. So, I mean, this one, most of what we're discussing right here has been mostly around reform and mostly Ashkenazi Jewish girls from middle class and upper class communities. That's mostly what we interviewed and looked at. So I hope that clarifies. Thank you for asking that.
Great.
Hi, it's Eileen.
Hi, Eileen.
Hi. So when you talked about how we incorporate, how we incorporate this into our, I may not be saying it right, but into the grants practice and with the grantees. So we have a program with the Orthodox Girls High School. We have a program that we support at a community high school on dating violence. So should we be, the point is that we should be not just giving them the money, but then actively discussing this with, pushing to do that, to say we want to talk about this with these groups. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, I didn't spend too much time on how one would get this done.
Yeah.
I'm getting are people hearing the echo or just me? Like all of a sudden my voice is echoing back. There is a couple ways to look at this. One is, I'm going to try to bring this up if I can. This is from the Women's Foundation of Minnesota. And did that come through to people? Okay, it just came up. So you can see, and I have permission to use this. This is how they explain what they did. They actually pulled gender norms through every facet of their work. So they started with their core values. You can see it in purple there. And then their theory of change, the outcomes that they want to think about and that they ask grantees for, and all the way through their evaluation questions. And so having done that, what they now are starting to do is to ask their grantees, how do you see gender norms affecting your work? What kind of support would you need to do it more effectively? Because I think most grantees get that they ought to do this once they know what we're talking about. We don't get a lot of pushback from grantees. Usually they're chomping at the bit. Why haven't we doing this before? What grantees tend to lack is the in-house expertise and capacity to develop their own exercises and curricula and train their staff up. So to answer your question, I think there are two pieces to this. One is the structural stuff of rethinking how this impacts the funding priorities and what you look for in grantees and what you ask them for and what you discuss with them. because most grantees are not going to offer this unless they're prompted because they think the funders aren't interested. And then the second piece is kind of the mechanics of how do you help grantees do this. And I think that comes, there are a couple tools that you can use. One thing we've done for some organizations is what we call gender audits, where we go in and talk with grantees. We look at their websites, materials, and talk to their people and find out where they feel that gender norms impacts their work, where they would like to see it reflected in their materials, what exercises they feel they need, what training and capacity. And then we also help them create exercises. And in this case, we already have some exercises we developed, but we help them adopt model exercises and use that in their work. And we make any adaptations they might need for their particular population and make sure their people are also trained up on it. Because a lot of times with grantees, as with funders, people are afraid to talk about gender norms. People get what I call jerkophobia. They're not sure of the distinction between gender norms, gender mainstreaming, gender identity, transgender, so they just avoid talking about it. And we try to get them over that hump so they feel comfortable talking about it. It becomes part of their DNA, and it also, the exercises become part of their work.
Great. Thank you. It gives us a lot to think about. So, I mean, which is what this whole thing is about, I know, but thank you so much.
Sure. It was a great question. And I'm sorry I didn't do more applied, but I was just trying to pitch the idea up front.
Are there other questions?
This is Andrea. I actually have a question. Riki, I think all this information is really helpful and fascinating and daunting on some level in terms of the work that we're interested in doing and committed to with our own fund. And I think internally, in terms of doing this sort of audit on ourselves, I think is a really good exercise for us when we're thinking about who we're funding. One of the things that we've been talking about, and which Rachel already mentioned, with this eating disorder program that we're going to do in February, one of the things that we're talking about is what kind of programming can we do to educate the broader community on some of these issues. We have 108 trustees who are committed to this gender lens concept and affecting social change for Jewish women and girls, but we also want to be able to educate our own community locally. Do you have any thoughts about, from a programmatic standpoint, about anything that we could do that would, have an impact locally, get people to be thinking about these things, be thinking differently about what their normative behaviors are, and at the same time, like we're in Atlanta, it's the South, it's pretty conservative. You have to tread really lightly around a lot of issues. Do you have any thoughts about what we could potentially do from a programming standpoint?
I mean, I guess my initial impulse is not going to surprise you, that just to make sure that we talk about femininity as part of the mix, because there's just voluminous research tying pressures around both achievement and around body weight and shape and feminine norms to eating disorders. And a lot of times girls develop them in order basically to have a sense of control. If they feel out of control, it can also be just a response to having their bodies go through this very public growth spurt during adolescence, where they develop secondary sexual characteristics, and it feels like the whole community is suddenly commenting on their body weight and their shape and everything. And obviously, and understandably, many girls flee from that, and eating disorders is a way to do that. I mean, I can keep going through the research, but there's a huge connection, and yet we see a lot of eating disorder programs that do not, like everything else, that tend to overlook gender norms. It can also be just a reaction to the sexuality of the adolescent years for girls, and girls trying to delay adolescence and have some sense of control over it. And for some girls, it's also a response to achievement pressures, the sense that they have to achieve, but also be feminine. And part of that achievement is just rigorous control and sometimes damaging control over eating, their eating, over control. So it would be wonderful to find a way to move feminine norms and femininity in that discussion back into the centerpiece of this. In Jewish communities, I think specifically there's a cultural resonance around food. There's so much interaction with Jewish girls and food. And it's such an important part for many of us of, what we think of as women's role and place in the home. And I think we need to make sure that that's part of the discussion too. I'm not sure if that's helpful or answers your question. Eating disorders are not a simple problem. There is no silver bullet, but I do think that the elephant in the room in a lot of the programs that I've looked at, and what's not often discussed, is the feminine norms piece. We discuss the behavior, but not the attitudes and beliefs girls have that are driving the behavior. And frankly, the communal attitudes and beliefs.
Okay, I think that's helpful. Thank you.
I hope so. I hope so. I once thought, just a sidebar, but I was asked by one of the women's, I think it was New York, to think more broadly. If we did some kind of national campaign around feminine norms, what would that look like? And my first idea, and I'm not saying this is a good idea by any means, but I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if you wanted to have something that could, people could do on their own and post to Facebook or Snapchat or anything else? Well, we just pick one holiday a year and have the men find and cook and serve the food from beginning to end. And let the women be the ones sitting at the table and the men cooking and serving it. And it's a kind of silly thing, right? But anybody could do it for fun, but it also highlights just how much we expect women to do certain things and to be in charge of certain parts of the holidays and to interact with food and serve men. And food plays such a central role, I think, in religious observance and the cultural rhythms of the week and everything. It would be really interesting to do something, maybe that's not the right answer, but something like that people could do just to kind of surface some of those attitudes and get people thinking about it.
Yeah, that would be interesting. It might be, when we're talking about the Jewish community, obviously there's a broad spectrum in terms of observances and sort of, what expectations are, and that might have a different kind of impact in one community versus another community.
Sure.
It would be interesting maybe to even suggest it just for a Shabbat. It would be much more accessible to just do, sort of an alternative Shabbat kind of thinking. But and I suspect that there would be some communities of people that would be very willing to do that, and there would be others where it would be extremely difficult to make that happen.
Sure.
Well, thank you.
Any other questions? Remember, you have to unmute your line if you're trying to talk. I can't hear you. Going.
I'm going to say one thing while people are thinking about it. I just want to say one of the things that we're starting to do for the Women's Foundation of New York, the New York Women's Foundation, sorry, is they're asking us, because they have I don't know, 60 or 90 grantees. It's a really big set of portfolios, and they're all kind of different. And they said, what would work across grantees, because we can't do this with every single grantee and every different kind of program. And what we're looking at for them are a series of self-assessment tools. So we would not only go in and audit them in terms of looking at their websites and materials, but also develop self-assessment tools that they could do, like, for instance, on an annual basis at retreats and stuff like that, that would help them assess where they are and how deeply or undeeply they have, or shallowly they've addressed gender norms in their own work. Because almost all the all the groups they fund feel that they have a very strong commitment to gender equity and a gender lens, but of course, it's typical, almost none of them are actually doing gender norms. And I don't know if that's something that would work for you all, especially in your work around, as you mentioned, eating disorders, but it would be interesting to have tools like that groups could use to see, are we tagging these bases? And not just this year when True Child is in town, but 4 years from now when they're gone, and a distant memory, are we still doing this? Is it still showing up? Are we still doing as good a job as we can on it? So just a thought.
I think that's a great idea. Ooh, I'm hearing myself echo. But I recently had a conversation with a potential grantee for this next year about submitting a proposal about gender audits for organizations in Atlanta, Jewish organizations in Atlanta, and I think that could be a very powerful tool.
Yeah, you have to be careful though. Some of the gender, probably if everybody could mute themselves, usually that reverb is caused by someone not muting themselves. There you go. Thank you so much. Yeah, GoToMeeting doesn't like that sometimes. But a lot of times that we've seen what are gender audits, it basically is counting the number of people on the board who are female, the number of people on the staff, et cetera, which is a really important start. It is not engaging gender norms at all. So we make sure you want to pull that all the way through. It's just a thought again.
Great, thank you. Any
Rachel,
final questions?
I have a question about the data. It's Eileen. And this is for Rachel and Riki. And Riki, because you do work with a lot of the foundations, and from some of us having gone multiple years to the conferences, I know we've taught and we're in process of a collaborative grant, but has this come up to actually do, you know, a national study that we all could participate in? Has that come up at all, Rachel? I mean, yeah.
Well, the collaborative grant is in Israel, and right. I have not heard about a gender norms piece to it, but I'm also not on that committee, so I wouldn't necessarily have the most up-to-date data.
But in general, I guess I would just like, and I think we're probably all lacking in data across the board, except for the few funds that have done pretty targeted research. So I would just suggest it's something to think about. And Riki, as you work with the funds, that, you know, that down the road that this is something we could all do and should think about.
Yeah, one of the things that you could remute again. I think we're getting the reverb again. But one of the things that I've been kind of gently pushing that I think would be interesting. So just a little bit of backstory. So the whole thing around gays in the military for years was held up because, you know, right-wing people would say, oh, you couldn't maintain good unit cohesion, or, you know, they couldn't take showers together, or, you know, whatever. And someone got tired of that, a gay man, and he decided that he would knock all those down, but he didn't have any money. So what he started doing was giving, you know, $3,000 to $5,000 to gay PhD candidates who would study one or more of those claims in their dissertations. And it took him about 15 years, but over 12 or 15 years, he basically helped support the publication of research that knocked a hole in every single one of those right-wing arguments, until you could not find anybody reputable who would then go on national television and say, yeah, gay people in the military are a threat to good unit and cohesion, blah, blah. So the reason I mention that by way of backstory is I think it would be interesting to consider doing the same thing. There are lots of Jewish girls who are motivated, who study gender theory, like, you know, we studied, you know, other theories in college. They're marinated in this stuff. They would love to study other Jewish girls, but they lack the resources. It'd be really interesting for the JWF foundations to get together and say, we're going to endow a fund, and each year we're going to pay for, I don't know, 3 or 4 dissertations. So let's say $15,000 or $20,000. But every year for the next 5 years, there are going to be 3 or 4 dissertations, and we're going to pick just the best ones that will specifically study the issue of Jewish girls and feminine norms and build this out. At the end of, you know, 5 years, you would have a significant body of research that would really help inform this for everybody at really marginal cost to any one organization. I just think that would be a really interesting idea and a great way for the JWS to collaborate on you know, just the utter lack of data in this part of the field. So
that's a very neat idea, and we are doing more to advance this idea of collaboration, both with the collaborative grant and then also with a separate group of people from across funds who are working on advocacy, which I think has more of a potential to be a domestic effort. So I will definitely bring that idea forward at our next phone call, because I think that that's great. Excellent idea.
Yeah, I love that idea. I think that's a fantastic idea. And I think some of the challenge, this is Andrea, sorry, I think that some of the challenge with that is just that we're so focused on programs and funding programs and seeing impact, you know, immediately or relatively quickly, and that this would be, you know, this is a different idea, but the impact would be so significant, and it would be an investment to have an longer term implications, which makes complete and total sense to me.
I also want to just add, thank you for that. I just want to add I think, I came from a deeply patriarchal family where, my grandfather studied to be a rabbi at Hebrew Union Seminary. So, I'm familiar with that part of the culture. When we talk to girls, one of the biggest challenges around their behavior and their idea of themselves is what boys think about them, or at least what they fear boys will think about them. So at some point, I think, to really get to gender equity, we're not only going to have to address the girl side of it, but we're going to have to find ways to address the boy side of it as well. And it'd be really interesting to have more research on the impact of highly patriarchal norms in some parts of this community on Jewish boys and how that impacts them as well, not only because they're important themselves, but also how it affects the girls that they interact and eventually marry.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely agree. Any final questions? Anyone else? Okay, and we certainly will share this webinar with those trustees who were not able to call in today. And if anybody who's viewing the presentation now or has questions later, we know that we're going to further this conversation because we've already identified this as one of our priority areas for the short term, whatever that short term is, the next few years. So we will come back to this and keep thinking through these important ideas. So Riki, I want to thank you so much. When we scheduled this, we did not know you were going to be sheltering in place from a hurricane. So even through that, I'm extra appreciative with everything going on in your house right now, that you joined us today to share your wisdom and your knowledge and these powerful ideas with us so that we really can move our work forward and elevate women and girls through grant making and through education and advocacy and research and anything else that we need to do to fulfill our mission. So thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank everybody I really appreciate everyone making this and for asking such really great and penetrating questions. Very exciting.
Great. So
Rachel, thank you for setting it up.
Everybody. Oh, thank you. Shabbat Shalom and Gamar Tova Chasima to everyone. And Riki, stay safe and dry.
Okay, you too. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.